Thanks very much for the invitation. This year I thought I would talk a little bit more about some of our more recent discoveries looking at different phytochemical compounds that are found in cannabis and their implications for mental health, again with a special focus on cannabidiol, because I know that's something that's of tremendous significance to the industrial hemp industry, and I hope to say a few words about that towards the end of the presentation. So cannabinoids, where are we now in terms of what we think is going on with cannabinoids and mental health? So obviously if you read the news, there's still a lot of controversy raging about the role of cannabinoids in mental health, the positive effects of cannabinoids, the negative effects of cannabinoids. But if you step back and look at the literature from a whole, the clinical and preclinical evidence suggests that it's a very complicated role for cannabis in terms of what it implies for the development and the treatment of mental health disorders. There's good effects and negative effects. I'm going to talk about both this morning. And most importantly, most of the evidence now suggests that there's specific phytochemicals in cannabis, in particular the psychoactive compound delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, something everyone's familiar with, versus cannabidiol, or CBD, and how they have very different effects on the brain and very different effects on potential mental health issues. So again, I always start this presentation with this one of my favorite slides from a review paper a couple years back showing the tremendous phytochemical complexity that we find in cannabis. CBD, again, one of the largest phytochemical components, and this just gives you a very cursory overview of some of the known clinical properties that some of these compounds have in treating various disorders, not just mental health disorders, but other sorts of disease states as well. In terms of the effects of THC versus CBD in mental health on the brain, if we compare them side by side, they have a somewhat similar molecular structure, but very different effects. So CBD is the most abundant cannabinoid in cannabis, usually around 40% of the plant, obviously different in hemp strains. But clinical and preclinical evidence shows that it has anti-anxiety effects, it has analgesic effects, so it's good for treating pain. It has sedative effects, and most importantly from the research we're doing, it has antipsychotic properties. And as I'm going to talk about later, may have some interesting implications for treating disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder. It doesn't directly activate the CB1 receptors. So the CB1 receptors are the receptors in your brain that interact with most cannabinoids, such as THC, but it can actually block the cannabinoid CB1 receptor. So it can actually be an antagonist to the effects of THC. And most importantly, it interacts with this receptor called the 5-HT1A receptor, which is part of the serotonin system. And everyone's familiar with serotonin. It's the neurochemical that's associated with drugs like Prozac, depression, mood disorders. So it has a very distinct profile from that of what we see in THC. Now THC, on the other hand, is the major, what we call psychoactive component in cannabis. In contrast to CBD, the clinical and preclinical evidence suggests that it can produce anxiogenic effects. It has paranoia-inducing properties. And the story that the cowboy poet was telling last night about his paranoid episode with marijuana, I found that quite interesting. That's a story that a lot of people will relate to you when their early experiences with marijuana. And it also has some hallucinogenic properties if it has high enough doses. It also strongly modulates emotional perception, and it produces reinforcing effects in animals. So we think that THC is the compound in cannabis that produces its addictive properties. So current strains of marijuana, if you were to go out and buy some on the street, or even in states where it's legalized like Colorado, the most popular sellers are high THC, low CBD strains. And this is a quote from way back in 1994 from the then director of the DEA, showing that the strains of marijuana that were currently found on the street had much higher levels of THC relative to CBD. So we're seeing this market-driven increase towards strains of marijuana that have much higher levels of THC versus CBD. And I was talking with some people from CBC's Marketplace who did an investigation in Colorado and found that sellers of marijuana in Colorado plants that were listing their marijuana strains as having around 20% THC, when they actually did an independent test, they actually had around 36 to 40% THC, which is absolutely stunning when you think about the implications of that. And now, from the clinical perspective, research done by a good colleague of mine, Robin Murray in the UK, has found that there are mental health implications for these high THC strains. So skunk is a strain of marijuana, sinsemilla, which has very high levels of THC, and that has been shown to triple the risk of psychotic episodes in certain individuals, and this is becoming a big problem in London in the UK. THC dabbing, I'm sure you're familiar with this, so marijuana users have figured out a way to extract the THC in a more purified form using alcohol and other sorts of alchemy techniques to extract the THC, and they produce these dabs which almost look like caramel with around 70% THC content. So again, it's the THC that seems to be driving a lot of these issues. So again, the biggest concern with high THC strains is based on the study that came out way back in 1987 from Sven Andersson and al. Showing that the adolescent brain, so teenage use of marijuana, increases the risk of developing schizophrenia in later adulthood. And this has been a study that's been replicated many different times. And at the time, we had no idea why this was the case, what were the mechanisms behind this. So my lab published a study just last year, and we tried to sort of definitively compare what the effects of THC exposure were on the adolescent brain versus the adult brain using animal models, rat models of THC exposure. And what we found was that adolescent THC exposure produced these behavioral effects that were similar to schizophrenia, these molecular effects in the brain that are similar to schizophrenia. I'll talk about those a little bit later on, and caused this hyperdopamine state, which I'll talk about also as well. And interestingly, what those studies also showed was that adult exposure to THC produced virtually none of these effects. So adulthood exposure to THC, even high strains of THC, appears to be reasonably safe, and it is the adolescent brain that is particularly vulnerable to high THC strains. Now let's just get a quick overview of the costs of mental illness in Canada, a problem that is largely being ignored. Mental health disorders such as schizophrenia, addiction, PTSD, they're costing us over $50 billion, billion with a B, annually. It is an extremely expensive proposition for our healthcare system. And even though there's some improvements in our treatments, most of the pharmacotherapies we have now have very limited efficacy. They have terrible side effects, and patients don't want to take them, especially schizophrenia medications, because there are side effects associated with them that are just intolerable to a lot of people. If anyone has a loved one or a friend that suffers from schizophrenia, I'm sure they'll be willing to share their experiences with some of these horrible side effects from the antipsychotic drugs that they take. Most of the major drug companies, and this is very disturbing from someone in the scientific research community, they've abandoned mental health altogether. They're no longer interested in doing mental health research because they have poor outcomes, and the research costs are quite outrageous, and lawsuits and all sorts of other sorts of legalities that are preventing them doing this. They've decided to spend most of their money on diseases like cancer, neurodegenerative disorders, and whatnot. So we really are in a state where we find ourselves in desperate need for novel, well-developed medications with fewer side effects. And I think that, as I'm going to try to demonstrate today, CBD might be one of those medications that has tremendous potential in this regard. So just a bit of a background, what exactly is schizophrenia? It affects about 1% of Canada's population, so a large number of people have this. The first symptoms of schizophrenia usually appear in late teens, early adulthood. The treatment options are very limited. The prognosis is extremely poor, and it tends to be a lifetime chronic condition, and sadly, in many cases, it ends in suicide because of the very poor prognosis and difficulty in finding effective treatments. So it's a very complex disorder. There's debate as to whether or not we should call it schizophrenia because of the diversity of the symptoms that are associated with it. But common symptoms are hallucinations, disorganized thoughts, hearing voices in your head, feelings of paranoia, anxiety, emotional dysregulation, distortion in emotional processing. On the other side, we have affective flattening, so a decreased ability to feel emotion, including pleasure. social withdrawal, so you start ignoring your friends and family, cognitive problems, so difficulty interpreting information, and cognitive filtering deficits as well, so an inability to filter out irrelevant information in your environment that your brain normally is very adept at doing, because we constantly have to filter out, tease apart what's important from non-important information in our environment. People with schizophrenia have a lot of difficulty doing this. So we divide these into the positive symptoms on one side and then the negative symptoms on the other side. So as you can see, there's a very complex array of symptoms that we have to take into consideration when we're looking for effective treatments. The prevalence of schizophrenia in Canada, right at the top there, it's more prevalent, 2 times as prevalent as Alzheimer's, 5 times more prevalent than multiple sclerosis, 6 times more prevalent than diabetes, and 60 times more prevalent than muscular dystrophy. And you'll be surprised to know that all of these disorders underneath schizophrenia receive exponentially more levels of funding than we give to schizophrenia, because there's still that stigma associated with schizophrenia that prevents, I suppose, funding agencies from being willing to provide the necessary funds for this sort of research. And the closer you are in a relationship to someone with schizophrenia, the more likely you are to develop it yourself, so there's a strong genetic component to it as well. And this just gives an overview here. So we know that there is a strong genetic component. It's not just environmental factors that lead to schizophrenia. So the neurobiology of schizophrenia, there's a lot of different competing theories about what causes it. Most of the evidence that we currently have points to disturbances in the brain's dopamine system. So again, throwing around a lot of anatomical terms, but the dopamine system is one of the systems that is definitely disorganized in schizophrenia, and I'm going to talk about how that might be relevant to THC versus CBD in these aspects. So 2 of the most important areas in your brain that are affected by dopamine irregularities in schizophrenia are called the prefrontal cortex, which is that area right behind your forehead, and then the nucleus accumbens, which is just behind it. I'll show you some anatomy in a second. All of the currently effective antipsychotic medications act by blocking the brain's dopamine system. So these are antipsychotic medications. So these are medications that stop the hallucinations, the paranoid ideation and whatnot, and they all do this through blocking the activity, shutting down the dopamine system. So in terms of the pathways in schizophrenia, 2 areas that I'll talk about quite a bit this morning. The ventrotegmental area here, this is part of your midbrain. This is where all the dopamine neurons are located. And then the nucleus accumbens, that area in the forebrain there. And then the prefrontal cortex right at the top there, right behind your forehead. And the pathways in the brain, if we look at it sort of from an overall anatomical point of view, we've got these dopamine systems right down there in your midbrain, and then the nucleus accumbens right here, and then the prefrontal cortex here. And the dopamine neurons send their projections to the nucleus accumbens, and it's the abnormalities in that pathway that are linked to schizophrenia. So we can just sort of summarize that by suggesting that the positive symptoms of schizophrenia are related to an overactivity of these dopamine cells, and the negative or the cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia are related to abnormalities, distorted patterns of signaling in the dopamine pathway in that projection going from areas like the ventrotegmental area up to the prefrontal cortex. So what do dopamine neurons do? So we think that they signal emotional salience of sensory information. So whenever you experience something that has some emotional impact, your dopamine neurons start firing. And the way that they fire is very important. So they can have a regular or sort of a tonic firing mode down here, just sort of this regular sort of straight pattern of firing. And then they can go into this bursting mode, which we believe is related to the more emotionally impactful as stimulus is, the neurons are more likely to start going into this sort of staccatic-like mode of firing. And I'm going to show you some evidence that CBD actually can control those different modes of firing and how that might be important for schizophrenia. This is a picture of the VTA. This is from the rat brain there, but remarkably, the human brain looks very similar in terms of its anatomy. So what is the evidence for CBD, cannabidiol, as an effective therapy for schizophrenia? There's a couple clinical trials that are going on now. GW Pharma has now moved on to stage 2 clinical trials, showing evidence that CBD can be a safe and effective treatment for schizophrenia symptoms. There's a lot of brain imaging studies showing that CBD can counteract many of the negative effects of THC, especially in the brain's dopamine pathways, not surprisingly. But interestingly, the mechanisms by which CBD produces its effects in schizophrenia are completely unknown. So we're sort of in an unusual situation where we've been running clinical trials before we've actually understood what CBD is doing in the brain. So that's sort of where our lab has been focusing its attention the past couple of years, trying to figure out exactly how CBD is modulating these schizophrenia-related pathways. So this is some really exciting evidence that came out from Lewicki's group back in 2012 in the journal Translational Psychiatry. And this was really the first published evidence that cannabidiol can improve the psychotic symptoms associated with schizophrenia. And don't worry about the details here, but what they did in this paper, they compared cannabidiol, pure cannabidiol, with a classical anti-schizophrenia drug called amisulpride, which is a dopamine blocking drug, a traditional antipsychotic drug. And what they found was that cannabidiol was just as effective at relieving those psychotic effects, but didn't have the nasty side effects associated with the traditional medication. So very exciting research that came out in 2025. And really, this is the paper that sort of inspired us to get going and look at what's going on sort of underneath the hood. So now the studies, we use preclinical models in our lab. We use rats, obviously, because we can't do these sorts of experiments in humans for obvious reasons. But this allows us a tremendous amount of detail and complexity that we can get into that we would not be able to do with the human brain. And most people are disappointed to find out that the human brain is actually remarkably similar to the rat brain. In terms of the anatomy, not all of us are rats. Some of us are, but the general anatomical features are the same. The cerebral cortex. So you just sort of do a comparison. We've got the same anatomical pathways, the same dopamine pathways, the same serotonin pathways. They're all the same. The obvious difference is that the rat brain doesn't have all this complex cortical convolutions, so it's a much more simpler system. But think of it as human brain version 1.0 in terms of its anatomy and overall features. So we started looking at the mechanisms of CBD by using a very well-established model of schizophrenia that's used a lot in not only in rats and mice, but in humans as well. And this is called the dopamine sensitization hypothesis of schizophrenia. And it suggests that schizophrenia is caused by a hyperactive dopamine system, which I talked about before. And we can mimic this sensitized dopamine system by giving amphetamine. So we just give amphetamine in measured doses, and you can give this. You can actually do this in both humans and rats, and it basically induces schizophrenia-like symptoms, both in the brain and both in terms of the behavior, by causing that abnormal hyperactive dopamine system in the brain. So that's what we did to sort of develop this model of schizophrenia in the rat, and to look at how CBD might be producing its therapeutic effects. So we published this paper last year in Journal of Neuroscience. Dr. Justine Renard, who is an extremely brilliant scientist in my lab, was running this research. And what she found was that cannabidiol, or CBD, it blocks this amphetamine-induced model of schizophrenia. Don't worry about all the details here, but I'll just sort of highlight some of the important features of this finding. So this is what the model looks like. You give the rat injections of amphetamine over a certain period of time, then we leave them alone for a couple weeks, and then by the 16th day, they have this schizophrenia-like phenotype. They have a hyperactive dopamine system, they have behavioral abnormalities that are like schizophrenia, they have problems with cognitive filtering. And then what we did in these studies, we actually went into their brains with an electrode and measured the activity of the dopamine neurons, combined with looking at their behavioral motor activity in this sensitivity chamber. So what we found first was that when we put CBD, we actually did microinfusions of CBD right into this area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens down here. And what we found was that CBD was able to totally block that sensitized response. So here we've got the vehicle control rats up here. Sorry, I'm trying to get this mouse to work here. The vehicle rats up on top here in the blue, and then the CBD, you can see it totally blocks that schizophrenia-like activity. This is the CBD in red, it blocked all of these different effects of amphetamine. So that was a really exciting discovery. And then we actually looked at the activity of the dopamine cells, and again, CBD was able to completely block those sensitized dopamine. So in the blue, again, we see the vehicle controls. The neurons get more and more active. They make it more like a schizophrenia brain, but CBD completely blocks those hyperactive neuron responses, both in terms of the firing rate, the speed at which the neurons are firing, and the bursting activity as well, which I mentioned before. The bursting is what we think is really important for schizophrenia. So CBD was able to block both of those effects. And again, this is just showing an example here. This is actually what the neuron looks like. This is just the electrical activity of the cell over time. So here's a control animal here. Here you see that hyperdopamine activity increase with amphetamine. And then once we gave CBD down here in red, that hyperactivity was completely blocked. And this is just showing you what the actual spiking patterns look like in the brain. So really, really excited to find that. And then we wanted to look at, beyond just the sort of the psychotic-like effects of schizophrenia, what about the cognitive problems of schizophrenia? So as I mentioned before, schizophrenia patients have a lot of problems with cognitive filtering, and this is manifest in what we call sensory motor gating deficits. So they basically lose the ability to filter out non-significant sensory information. So if you had schizophrenia and you're sitting in this room, you might think that the screen is a signal from aliens or something. You attach all this abnormal emotional significance to things in your environment that normally you would filter out, irrelevant information. Okay, so currently no schizophrenia medications improve the cognitive effects of schizophrenia. So this is a big hole in our clinical treatment. So what we did with these rats is we measured the deficit in a procedure called pre-pulse inhibition. So don't worry about the details of this, but basically what it means is that normally, let's say you're just sitting in a chair and someone drops a plate next to you, you have this startle response and you sort of freak out a bit. But if someone was to drop a knife on the floor before the plate dropped, your response to the plate would be less, because your brain does this gating procedure where it filters out. It's able to sort of determine what's relevant and what's not relevant. This is a natural process in your brain, and people with schizophrenia have problems with this. So what we found was that CBD reverses these schizophrenia-like deficits in sensory filtering. So again, don't worry about all the details here, but the relevant thing here would be just the vehicle control rats here. Here you see, relative to a control animal, the percentage of the pre-pulse inhibition is around 70%, but with amphetamine it goes down, but with CBD in the black, it goes back up. So CBD is able to reverse those cognitive deficits of schizophrenia. And this is extremely exciting. This, in many ways, this is more exciting than the previous evidence because, as I mentioned before, all of the traditional antipsychotic medications, they don't treat these symptoms. So CBD seems to be unique in being able to treat some of these cognitive problems with schizophrenia. So now I start really throwing out some terminology here. Don't worry about the specifics of these details here. These are some of the molecular pathways that are important in schizophrenia. So they have different effects in CBD versus THC. So as I mentioned before, all of the effective antipsychotic medications, they act through this dopamine receptor called the D2 receptor, and the D2 receptor is linked to these downstream pathways called GSK3, AKT, beta-catenin, the mTOR pathway, and that goes into an mTORC1, mTORC2, and then this P70S6 kinase pathway. These are all disturbed in schizophrenia, and they're related to the effects of the drugs. So what we found, now going back to the adolescent THC exposure, what we found was that the THC downregulates mTOR levels in the brain in a very significant way. So here you see the downregulation following adolescent THC exposure here, and this is just a readout of the molecular levels of this signaling pathway. And mTORC is also related to autism, drug addiction, depression, in addition to schizophrenia. So it's a very important molecular marker for these sorts of problems. Now again, with the chronic adolescents, we saw this big downregulation in this molecule called P70S6 kinase. It's a really huge effect. You can see that in THC, the protein level goes all the way down here both at the phosphorylation level and the total levels as well. So again, we see this big abnormality caused by adolescent THC in these brains. So what does CBD do? Oh, and just one other thing I'd mention here as well. The mTOR pathways and the P70X6 kinase pathways here are dysregulated in major depression as well. So here we see that this is from human evidence showing that mTOR and P70 is down. So THC is causing these pretty disturbing molecular changes that are associated with not only with schizophrenia, but disorders like depression as well. So what does CBD do? So CBD, remarkably, we found does the exact opposite to that of THC. So here we've got protein levels of these pathways in the nucleus accumbens I was talking about before. The GSK pathway is down with CBD, but the mTOR pathway is way up, and the P70X6 kinase pathway is way up. So the take-home message is that CBD is counteracting those negative effects of THC. So it's a really remarkable finding that two phytochemicals in the same plant can have the exact opposite effects on these pathways. So just to summarize that, CBD has a unique mode of action in the brain. It's opposite to that of THC. It can counteract the effects of THC. So again, just sort of summarizing the ups and downs of these pathways here. This is, in blue, this is the traditional pathway that most antipsychotics act on. So drugs like haloperidol, amylsulpride, they act through this GSK3 beta-catenin pathway. What we found was that, more importantly, CBD acts through this mTOR P70S6 pathway. So it seems to bypass those traditional antipsychotic pathways in the brain, and what we think that might mean is that is why CBD has a much better profile in terms of side effects. Maybe the negative side effects with the traditional drugs are linked to its actions up here, but CBD can bypass it down here, and it seems to produce very few side effects in patient populations. So again, very exciting difference between CBD and traditional medications. Now I'm just going to shift gears a bit, talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, something that's been in the news quite a bit, especially in terms of medical marijuana. A lot of veterans have been using medical marijuana to treat some of their PTSD symptoms. It's obviously characterized by this uncontrollable recall of traumatic memories. About 10% of the population will experience PTSD, some form of PTSD during their life, and that's a huge number of people. And it's not just military veterans. It's first-line responders like policemen, firemen, paramedics, and just anyone that's had motor vehicle accidents, a death in the family, sexual assault. All of these traumatic experiences can lead to very serious PTSD in people. So people that have it will experience panic attacks, chronic anxiety, which leads to depression. They have a dramatically elevated risk of suicide, which is very disturbing. And as I mentioned before, it can affect anyone at any time. Now, how do we model PTSD with rodents? One way to do this is through what we call fear conditioning, where we basically produce a traumatic memory by pairing a cue in the environment with a foot shock. So here you see a rat in one of these traditional Skinnerian boxes. You've probably seen this in your Psychology 101 courses. And you know, they essentially receive some sort of a cue, a light, or some sort of a smell, and then they get a foot shock, and they learn to associate the foot shock with that cue. Just like in PTSD, you form this traumatic memory. So we can use either low levels of foot shock that normally do not produce fear memories, or higher levels of foot shock that do produce very strong fear memories in these animals. And what we measure here is the freezing. So all mammals, when they are afraid, will engage in this freezing response. So the animal literally freezes up when they're experiencing this traumatic memory, sort of the deer in the headlight type effect, when we give them the presentations of the stimulus that's been paired with the foot shock. So we just published this last year. Chris Norris and a few other people in my lab, he's a PhD student, and he wanted to see what does CBD do in terms of traumatic memory formation. So again, we went back to our sort of neuroanatomical locus here in the nucleus accumbens. Again, this is a picture from the study. And what he did was he actually put CBD, he micro-infused CBD directly into the nucleus accumbens, and he looked at fear memory formation, traumatic memory formation. And what he found was that, first of all, THC actually makes normally non-salient fear memories more salient. So it actually increases the anxiety associated with fear. So this is in a lower level of fear. So here you see in a normal sort of control animal, this level of foot shock doesn't produce a fear memory. This is the amount that the animal is freezing. That's the measurement of the memory. But with THC into the accumbens, we actually see an increase, an abnormal increase in the amount of fear memory that's formed. So we can actually sort of manipulate the intensity of the traumatic memory with THC. Now, CBD remarkably blocks this effect. So THC, in opposite action to THC, block the ability to form a fear memory here in a dose-dependent way. So here the animal showing the same amount of response to both the CS conditioned stimulus, the control stimulus, and the experimental stimulus here. So essentially the take-home message is that CBD and THC again produce opposite effects on traumatic fear memory formation. Now, we wanted to actually see what is the mechanism. So what is CBD doing in the brain beyond all of the molecular stuff we talked about before, which is very important in and of itself, but what is sort of happening at the systems level in the brain? So what we did was we did a series of studies where we infused CBD directly into the nucleus accumbens, and then we recorded the activity of the dopamine neurons in the ventral tegmental area. So this is all done simultaneously, and this is just a cross-section of the brain. And again, the human brain looks exactly the same, the nucleus accumbens and the VTA. So just so you know where we are sort of in the human anatomy. So what did we find? So first of all, just before I get into the results, the mesolimbic dopamine system has a micro-regulation, and don't worry about all the details of this, but all you need to sort of know is that we have what's called these GABA interneurons, and these are sort of like the braking mechanism in your brain. They're inhibitory. They release a chemical called GABA, which shuts down the cells that it interacts with. So here we have in the VTA, the GABA neurons release GABA, they shut down dopamine, and what we think is going on in disorders like schizophrenia is there's not enough of these GABA neurons, so the dopamine system is hyperactive. So it's sort of like a brake in the brain that controls the release of dopamine in areas like the mesolimbic pathway. So we looked at the GABA neurons and the dopamine neurons and what was CBD doing to those effects. So remarkably, what we found was that CBD decreased the activity of the dopamine neurons. So most of these neurons, around 60% of the neurons we sampled, had decreased activity. And this is just showing you the firing effect. Here with CBD, we see a significant drop in the firing levels of these neurons, and also in the number of bursts. So it also stopped the bursting activity levels of those dopamine neurons, which again we think is important for its ability, obviously not only for PTSD, but for treating schizophrenia as well. And interestingly, what it did, it actually increased the activity of those GABA neurons. So it actually increased the activity. Most of the neurons showed an increase, around 40%, or rather a plurality of the neurons showed an increase. And again, this was a significant effect in the firing frequency. And here's what one of these neurons looks like. You put CBD into the nucleus accumbens and you get this increased activity of this inhibitory GABA neuron in the VTA. So a really interesting effect, and we were able to sort of really nail down what that mechanism is in the brain for what CBD is doing to improve some of these symptoms. Now, to contrast that again, because I keep going back to these contrasts with THC, adolescent THC causes a hyperactive effect on dopamine neurons. So this is what we saw in the adolescent treated rats. The dopamine neurons are hyperactive, exactly what we sort of see in a schizophrenia-like phenomena. And I don't have time to discuss it today, but in the adults, this effect was absent. So again, go back to the sensitivity of the adolescent brain for THC-related disturbances. And that's just showing you the vehicle control rats versus the adolescent exposure rats, that increased level of activity. So what we think is going on, CBD's therapeutic effects depend on its ability to modulate the dopamine system. So CBD can act in the nucleus accumbens here, and it can dramatically control the activity states of the VTA dopamine system, and that is what we think is happening sort of at a systems level in terms of its ability both to act as an effective treatment for schizophrenia and to blunt traumatic memory associated with PTSD. Now, The second important part of this story is that cannabidiol, as I mentioned at the outset, acts through the serotonin system. And it acts on a specific receptor called the 5-HT1A receptor. And this was a study, a very important study done by Ethan Russo. Some of you might know Ethan Russo. He's involved in the medical marijuana industry with a company that's based in the UK. And what he showed was that CBD can act as an agonist at the 5-HT1A receptors. This is just measuring the ability of CBD to displace serotonin from the 5-HT receptor. Again, don't worry about the details of it, but the take-home message is that it can actually act on that serotonin receptor to produce its downstream effects. So what Chris was able to show was that when he administered a 5-HT1A blocking drug, he was able to reverse the effects of CBD. So this, again, don't worry about all the details here, but this is with a drug called NAD, which is a 5-HT1A antagonist drug. And here you can see that he blocks, the animals now show a normal fear response because he was able to block the 5-HT. So that suggests that 5-HT1A is the receptor responsible for CBD's effects. And interestingly, when he tried to block the dopamine system with this drug called alpha flu, there was no effect. So at the receptor level, CBD modulates the dopamine system, but not through dopamine receptors. It goes through a serotonin receptor system, and then through indirect mechanisms modulates the serotonin. So a very unique mode of action for CBD, something that we really haven't ever seen before. And the same goes with the neuronal activity. So then Chris looked at how, or rather Michael Lareo did this study where he looked at, again, using this NAD drug here, he was able to, here you see CBD decreasing the levels of the dopamine neuron, firing and the bursting right here in the light gray, and then with the gray, when he administered that 5-HT1 antagonist, the effect came back. So again, it depends on this 5-HT system, and again, the dopamine blocker had no effect on that as well. So again, acting through the serotonin system, which is really interesting because so many psychiatric drugs also act through that same serotonin pathway. So to summarize that, CBD regulates the mesolimbic dopamine system. It increases the activity of the GABA interneurons, and it decreases the activity of the dopamine neurons. And it can act directly in the nucleus accumbens through a serotonin receptor system. And we still don't know exactly how that's doing it because the serotonin receptors are located on various different elements inside that microstructure. So that's what we're sort of trying to figure out right now, exactly where in the nucleus accumbens that serotonin system is producing these downstream effects in this pathway. So to conclude, CBD is a promising treatment option for both schizophrenia and PTSD, and there's evidence now from preclinical work like what we're doing and from clinical studies as well suggesting this is the case. It operates through non-traditional molecular pathways different from current medications, and unlike current medications, CBD is capable of improving both psychosis and the cognitive problems that we see in schizophrenia. And notably, what it seems to do is it can modulate the dopamine system through actions on the serotonin system, which is, again, I emphasize again, this is a very unique mechanism, and we haven't seen that with traditional medications up till now. And also importantly, it has excellent patient tolerability with very few side effects that are reported, so it seems to be a very safe medication. It doesn't have all those nasty side effects associated with traditional antipsychotics. And most importantly, I think, CBD acts in an opposite manner to THC. And I think this has a lot of important implications for how we're moving forward in terms of legalization, in terms of keeping tabs on strains of marijuana that have relatively high versus low levels of CBD, because I think that ultimately the most important clinical effects of medical marijuana are going to come down to the CBD system as opposed to THC. So to summarize, THC, adolescent exposure increases schizophrenia risk, not adulthood exposure, so we have to be vigilant to keep it out of the hands of teenagers. It dysregulates the dopamine system like we see in schizophrenia. It can turn on schizophrenia-related molecular pathways, and it's responsible for some of the addictive properties of marijuana, and it has been shown to worsen certain PTSD symptoms. CBD, on the other hand, blocks these negative effects of THC. It normalizes the dopamine system. It treats schizophrenia symptoms, and it turns off schizophrenia-related molecular pathways and might serve as an effective treatment for PTSD symptoms. So to sort of bring it all home, I think that the Canadian industrial hemp industry could be and should be a major source for pharmaceutical-grade CBD. And I'll just tell you how we do these experiments. How do we get CBD? How do we get purified CBD? Well, despite the fact that we're sitting on an ocean of CBD here in this country, I can't get CBD in Canada. I need to buy it from the UK. Because of current regulations, I apply for a license, which is fine. I get an exemption, but then I need to import it through the UK because we can't actually bring it through the US because of the FDA regulations in the US. So I literally pay an arm and a leg to get this pharmaceutical-grade CBD from the United Kingdom. So, in this position paper that was put forth by CHTA, that I assume is going to be discussed later today, I think it's vitally important from the scientific research community that we need to have better access to these purified phytochemicals, because ultimately, moving forward with medical marijuana and this industry, we need to have access to these phytochemicals in a reasonable manner. We shouldn't have to go, a Canadian scientist shouldn't have to go to the UK to get purified CBD when we're literally sitting on oceans of it here in Canada. So I thought I would end on that sort of note. And again, thank the very talented people involved in this research. Justine Renard, a major player in most of this research, and our funding partner, CIHR and CERC, and more recently, the Ontario Mental Health Foundation, who has really helped us with this research. A big shout out to the Ontario Mental Health Foundation. And thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
One's about delivery system. So, considering the CBD and how it gets delivered and how it gets through the blood-brain barrier, is that an implication? I'll ask two questions. Is that a problem? And the second one is, what are the effects of the normalization of dopamine on Parkinson's disease?
Yeah, that's a great question. CBD, in most formats I'm aware of, if you're given it orally, it easily crosses the blood-brain barrier, so that hasn't been an issue. The problem with oral administration is that it's going to affect everywhere in the brain. We haven't looked everywhere in the brain. We've only looked at certain areas in the pathway. So if CBD, by some chance, has a negative effect on another part of the brain, that could be potentially a problem with oral administration. Unfortunately, that's all we have available at the moment, but it easily crosses the blood-brain barrier. We're trying to do a clinical trial now with a psychiatrist friend of mine at Western Ontario, looking at CBD as a potential treatment for dementia in his Alzheimer's patients, and that we are going to probably be administering CBD oil with looking at different concentrations of CBD oil. So we're in talks to try to get that set up. Your second question was about Parkinson's disease. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. There is some evidence that patients with Parkinson's have some improvement in their in their symptoms with medical marijuana. I don't think anyone knows what strains of marijuana they're using. Are they high THC or low THC? And again, I don't want to completely demonize THC. THC seems to be dangerous, particularly during adolescence, but not in adulthood. So adults, obviously people with Parkinson's are for the most part middle-aged and older, even strains with high THC. If it turns out that THC can activate the dopamine system and improve the dopamine system, because in Parkinson's, you've got a depression in the dopamine system. So for something like Parkinson's, it's easily conceivable that higher THC strains might actually be more beneficial for those patients, but we still need to figure out exactly how that works.
I'd like a couple points of clarification, because I come from the health span and lifespan extension world, and when I see mTOR or the target of rapamycin,
yeah.
That's a hot area in health span and lifespan optimization, and
right.
I'm taking that NAD is nicotine adenine dinucleotide.
Yes.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Those are two very hot areas in the growing field of enhancing your health span and your lifespan. And if CBD has some key effects in this area, there's a really big, a huge opportunity for research into that. Is that not right?
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, absolutely. And there's some interesting work we're looking at collaborating with, I mentioned the GSK pathway as well, which is also important for Alzheimer's disease. And CBD seems to decrease the phosphorylation state of GSK3 versus THC. So we think that CBD might also have some effects in the GSK pathway for treating some of the dementia, the memory loss associated with Alzheimer's disease as well. Yeah.
I was just wondering, I know that gabapentin is one of the drugs used for ADHD, and I'm wondering if this has an effect. Has there been any testing done on the effects of ADHD with CBD?
That's a great question. At the top of my head, I don't know if there's actually clinical trials with ADHD. The problem with ADHD is it's extremely difficult to model it in rodents, and unfortunately, a lot of the preclinical work uses rodent models. It can be done, but I don't think anyone's looked at, as far as I might be wrong, I don't think anyone's looked at CBD in terms of controlling attentional regulation. But in terms of gabapentin, what CBD is doing, it is acting like gabapentin. Right. It's increasing GABA levels. Yeah. So it's reasonable to assume. Now, the other issue with the other interesting thing about ADHD is that it's treated with Ritalin, which is basically amphetamine. With ADHD, the theory is that the dopamine system is already at this elevated level, but they operate on this bell-shaped curve. So if you've got someone with ADHD with a really high dopamine level up here, and then you give them amphetamine, you actually put them down here because it goes overboard. It's like, when you drink too much coffee and you crash. It's the same sort of idea with the dopamine system. That's a great question. I think that there's more research that needs to be done in that area for sure. Yeah.
I'd like to have you maybe clarify something. Dr. Ethan Russo has the entourage effect paper, yeah. And you talked about sourcing pure CBD, and then you later talked about oil with smaller concentrations. Yeah. We've been hearing in the CBD-only states in the U.S. where they have to use pure CBD, the efficacy rate is a lot less than the entourage effect. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Obviously, it's there's a reason these two phytochemicals have evolved in the same plant. They obviously serve some sort of botanical. It's outside my area of expertise, but at the receptor level, the CBD effect is controversial. There's some pharmacologists that argue that CBD does not interact in any way with the CB1 receptor system, but it could interact with other cannabinoid receptors. So there's another one, there's CB2, which is the second major physiological cannabinoid receptor system. There's another one called GPR55, which we've started looking at as well. And there's some evidence that cannabidiol interacts with GPR55, which also might link up with the CB1 receptor. So that's how CBD and THC might have to somehow interact with each other at the receptor level to produce their full effects of those downstream molecular pathways. We've only looked at it in purified forms. What we want to do is start a series of experiments where we modulate the relative ratios of THC and CBD. I can tell you one study we've done so far in terms of some memory deficits. We found that THC-induced memory deficits was reversed by co-administration with THC, but not by itself. So there does appear to be a synergistic effect, and I think that the pharmacologists sort of need to get a better grip on exactly how they're acting at the cannabinoid receptor level, and what the implications for those downstream pathways are in terms of producing a physiological relevant effect.
Thank you again.
Thank you.